Evening. Tonight I have titled this The Story of David from Poor Shepherd Boy to King. We will essentially be studying the books of Samuel 1 and 2 and 1 Kings. Now, before we actually get to David, there are some things that we need to know up front. But first, I just wanted to start with this. The Bible is the library. It has many books filled with humankind's experiences with God and Spirit. And I wanted to put this in here because we are studying the Old Testament. And the Old Testament, for most people, is just not very interesting. It's a whole lot of war and battles and blood and all that kind of stuff. But if you look at it from the point of view of a little bit of history and looking at the culture and what the people were like, what their beliefs were, and that's what makes the Old Testament so very relevant, as we'll see tonight. Okay, so just a little bit of history. The books of Samuel and probably one Kings and took place during the period of from 1120 to 900 BC. What was going on then is that the Israelites were fighting the Philistines, trying to earn their promised land, fight for their promised land. And at that point in time, where we're going to start tonight, Israel was ruled by judges. Okay. Now, the other significant, there's three things that we're going to emphasize. And the next thing is culture. And one of the cultural things that's very important throughout the Old Testament is that in those ancient days, whatever happened to anyone, good or bad, was always attributed to God. Now, this was a belief system and the consciousness of the times. And as we read more of the Old Testament, you will see this in action, and we will pay attention to that as we go along. But mostly because we're interested in the spirit of the word, and essentially, and the role that God plays or played back then. So the role that God plays in the lives of humankind is no different than any other time in the history of the world. So what they experienced in the Old Testament, what they experienced, we'll call it spiritually, is no different than what we as humankind experience today. For the spiritual things that we experience, the love, joy, and yes, sorrow, anger, peace, harmony, okay, all of our emotions are all related to our inner selves. And we are all basically from that, we are all equal concerning our inner selves because we are all made in the image and likeness of God. So, how we experience these things is no different from the Old Testament than it is for us now. The feel is the same no matter what culture or time or circumstance in the history of the world. And even though in our world we have atheist religions with different doctrines and different worldly things, humankind experiences with God or spirit are the same. So just wanted to point that out, and because we're going to be looking at those emotions and experiences with God that David had and a couple of others. So there's a couple of characters here that we're going to introduce before we get to David. All right, the first one is Hannah, and you will find that in 1 Samuel 1:10-11. And Hannah was bitter of soul, and she prayed before the Lord and wept bitterly. And she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look upon the affliction of my maid servant, and remember me, and not forget thy handmaid, but will give to thy maid servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. Now, there's a good bit in between, but Hannah was barren for many years. She was bitter of soul, just like Naomi and Ruth was when we studied Ruth, because she did not have a son. She had no children. And that made her bitter of soul. And she prayed constantly that she would have a son. And if she had that son, she said she would give him to the Lord. And she said, no razor will come upon his head. This is referring to something called the Nazarite vow. And the Nazarite vow, those whom it applied to, their hair would not be cut. And there were several other things like no drink and things like that. So that's what she's referring to. Okay, so we're not going to read all the scriptures, but then when we get to 1 Samuel 1:27-28, I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition, which I asked of him. Therefore also I have promised him to the Lord as long as he lives. For I petitioned him of the Lord, and they worshiped the Lord there. So even though she only has one son at this point, she promised him to the Lord, and she gave him to the Lord. And when her son was born, she was, you might say, redeemed in the eyes of her peers, because women who were barren, they were mocked, they were picked on, and they also, their inner struggle was because they believed if they were barren, then they must have done something wrong. But now she has had the son, and I wanted to put this in here. It's an idiom. And Hannah prayed and said, my heart is magnified in the Lord, my horn is exalted in my God. Basically, Hannah now rejoiced because her heart was no longer sad and her soul was no longer depressed. Therefore, she spoke out and used Semitic idiomatic phrases. My mouth is enlarged, or as the Aramaic text reads, my heart has increased or grown strong. Means now I can talk back and say plenty. So in this verse, heart is used metaphorically, referring to the mind or the chest area as the seat of intelligence.
She figured it out.
All right. And the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord, assisting Eli the priest, and the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision, and it came to pass at that time, when Eli was lying down in his bed, and his eyes had begun to grow dim, so that he could not see. And the lamp of the Lord was not yet put out, and Samuel was lying down to the sleep in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. And the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, Here I am. And he ran to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. And he said, I did not call. Go back and lie down. And he went and laid down, and the Lord called again, Samuel. Samuel rose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you did call. And he answered, I did not call, my son. Go back and lie down. Now Samuel did not know the Lord, neither was the word of the Lord revealed to him.
Okay. All right, now I'm okay. And the Lord called Samuel again the third time, and Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you did call me. Then Eli, the old priest, perceived that the Lord had called the boy. Therefore, Eli said to Samuel, Go back and lie down, and it shall be, if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for thy servant hears. So Samuel went back and lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood and called twice, Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel said, Speak, Lord, for thy servant hears. Okay, so this was how Samuel was called by God to be a prophet, and to, you will see, well, basically to be a prophet and to guide the kings during his lifetime as a prophet. So then if we go to, this is actually going back, but, and the boy Samuel grew up and was in favor both with the Lord and also with men. Now, one thing I didn't tell you about these books of Samuel and a number of books in the Old Testament is you can't read them like they're in chronological order. Okay, they just have the episodes, but you will find an episode maybe a little later on that actually occurred before the last one. So just remember that, because it's not chronological, and that's why you see I went back to chapter 2, because that was part of another story. But mainly here, the prophets, remember, all the prophets received their orders from God, and they passed those on to the kings. Okay. Now, so let's look at this because Samuel is very important. All right. There had been no prophet or seer who could guide the destiny of the 12 tribes of Israel during this period of time. They received no spiritual directions from the Lord God. And I think back, we saw when it talked about the term no open vision. I think it did here. Let me see. Yes. Okay. And it said that the word of the Lord came, was precious, and there was no open vision. Now, what that meant is that Samuel received God's communication, so to speak. He heard it directly. There was no the other prophets, and when you read the other prophets received their messages, their communication in symbols, okay, but not Samuel, okay. So God communed with this little boy whose mind was clear and whose thoughts were pure and who could hear the word of God. Everything that God revealed to Samuel was spoken in words and not with symbols. So Samuel, at a young age, was becoming a mystic. He was developing the gift of hearing God's words and could understand the message. He did not have to decipher symbols like most seers. And that is the case with most psychics and mediums today. They deal with symbols because spirit communicates many times with symbols. Okay, so now there was one other. Okay, when we read about Moses. Okay, Moses, God spoke directly to Moses also, but Samuel, after Moses, Samuel was the only one who had these open vision, which means that God talked directly to him in words and not symbols. So we have Samuel the prophet and Samuel very capable of listening to God and hearing God's message. So Samuel was a great prophet and a true judge over Israel. As a leader, he never deviated from the way of God. He upheld the Mosaic law and the ordinances and led the people during the time of their distress and subjugation under the Philistines. So Samuel, when it says he was a true judge over Israel, he was the only judge over all Israel. All the other judges before him. And so we're going to learn next week about how it came about that Israel started to have kings. Okay, and that again, Samuel plays a big role in that, and of course we will be looking at David as the king. Now we're going to go back. I'm going to go back to a Matthew, the Gospels, and back to what we just what we just read about. God communed with this little boy whose mind was clear and whose thoughts were pure, and you could hear the word of God. Okay, we go back to Matthew 18:3. And this is Jesus now. And Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, unless you change and become like little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, let's remember about entering the kingdom of heaven. Another way of putting it, because of the word kingdom, is you shall not be able to hear the message of God, which will guide you. And remember, the kingdom it's the counsel and the guidance of God. But unless you change and become like a little children, you won't be able to do that. So how do we become like a child? Well, it says right here, we've got to clear out our minds. We've got to clear out the junk, and there's lots of it. And um, unfortunately, a lot of it is put there by our belief systems, by what we have come up with, that may or may not coincide with getting your counsel and or going directly to God. So I wanted to make sure when we do the Old Testament that we kind of get a message for all of us to that it might just help us, but become like a child. And the only way I know, okay, is I meditate. That's my thing. But many other people, especially people that have kind of gotten confused and frustrated with their religion, theirs is a bigger task to be able to open up and hear that message from God and get that counsel. And the only thing I can say is that I will attest to the fact that it really it really I hate to say it really works, but it does. Once you get all the negative stuff out, it will happen. So, all right. So we're gonna just think about this. All right. So Hannah, God's role with Hannah. Hannah was deeply hurt and resentful, bitter of spirit, because she was barren. But she prayed and basically never lost faith. And I think we find that hard to believe because the culture that we looked at, that, well, God was responsible for the good and the bad. But maybe that was a good thing, because she never lost faith. And of course, she didn't have all the media and stuff that we do, that she would think about, well, why is God, why is God doing this or not doing that? But in any event, she stayed with the faith, and the hurt, the resentfulness, and everything was replaced with joy after she had prayed. And even though she was giving that son over to the Lord, she was also blessed after that with many more children. So we're also looking at Thanksgiving, and she thanks God. Okay. Okay. Yes. Thank you all very much for your contributions. And so I just have a little something. Maybe we'll get some discussion tonight. That would be nice. But it's like can we relate to Hannah, even though her culture was different, her feelings, her faith, and I guess with Hannah, I mean, I kind of suggest that it may have been slightly different in her culture, because if we don't bear children here, it's not such a um, uh, it's not a put down, so to speak. But there are many women struggling to have children who can't, and their feelings, I'm sure, are the same as Hannah's was, and hopefully their faith. But I think it's just a little more difficult in our world today to hang on to faith when those things are happening. But anyway, and then just another one just to think about. Are you open to hearing the voice of God like Samuel? And that's what we just talked about. And that's what Jesus talked about.